Hey guys, welcome back to Builds by Maz. Today I'll be showing you how I replaced this horrible fence leading to my side yard. This fence was very poorly designed and constructed. You can see there's an exposed beam on the left side, the gate opens the wrong way, the wood wasn't stained or protected so it's grayed and deteriorating, and there's gaps all along the bottom of the fence. But I'll show you all the steps I took to transform this fence into something completely new. Now I love my side fence and it really adds a lot more curb appeal to my home. Let's get started. First things first, I measured out all the dimensions of my fence and then went to Home Depot and got a bunch of cedar 6-foot fence pickets. It's a little annoying, but these all have tags stapled to the bottom and I had to pull them all off individually with needle nose pliers. Then I went through the whole stack and decided which side of each picket that I liked better so I could have it facing outward. Sometimes with these wood fence pickets, you'll get rough patches or these little wood strands hanging off the edges. So I went ahead and sanded all those down smooth. This is for an outdoor fence after all, so I didn't spend a ton of time sanding. I just wanted to get rid of any major flaws. I then went through and removed all the fence pickets currently in the gate, which was a simple matter of unscrewing them one at a time. I also want to point out all these streaks coming from the screws in the wood. This comes as a result of using cheap screws and not sealing the wood properly, so we're going to be sure to avoid that. You can see how rusted this screw is that I pulled out, and that's something you just don't want to have in your fence. I continued removing all these pickets and then had to remove some of the gate hardware that used nuts and bolts. A lot of the metal gate pieces, including these hinges, could actually be reused, so I took a little extra care when removing them. I popped out the last couple of pickets that were stuck into the fence hardware, and then using my angle grinder, I cleaned off the surface of the whole thing. If you're wanting to build a gate from scratch, you could definitely build a support piece like this out of lumber, but luckily this metal piece was actually pretty good, and all it needed was a cleaning and some new fresh metal paint. I bought some new replacement bolts, and I painted these as well as the hinges, giving everything a nice solid black color, but also helping with rust protection. Next, I had to deal with the non-gate portion of the fence. All these pickets were held in with nails instead of screws, and my original idea was to try and just pry off all the pickets, but it wasn't working that well. After getting through a couple of pickets, I decided it would be easiest to just cut the whole thing out and rebuild this section of the fence. I cut out all these support beams and then removed the whole piece as one. I had to pry off all these little end pieces left from the cuts, but then I was ready to start rebuilding. Using pressure-treated 2x4 lumber, I measured out the correct length and then cut this brace piece to size. Then, with my Craig jig, I drilled a couple of pocket holes for attaching it to the vertical posts. These are called backer rails and will hold all the pickets in place. After fitting it into place, I double-checked to make sure the board was level, and then using 3-inch screws, 2 on each side, I drilled it into place. I repeated this process 2 more times, adding a backer rail to both the top and bottom of the fence. I then wanted to get started on the gate, and I had to test out a few different overlap patterns so that the total distance would match up correctly with the width of the gate. After taking some measurements, I ripped down one of the old pickets to size and used it as a spacer. This was a convenient way to make sure that all the spaces between my pickets would stay consistent. Now I already showed you what can happen if you use bad screws, so I'm using these high quality Deckmate 3-inch coated screws made for outdoors. I screwed the first picket in right along the fence post, and then used my spacer to position the second picket, making sure everything was still level, and then screwed that one into place as well. Then I screwed in the first overlapping picket. It's really important to get this one right in the center of the other 2 pickets because it'll dictate the spacing for the rest of the fence. From there, I got into a routine and could just move along the fence line, occasionally checking to make sure each piece was level to the one next to it, as well as it being level vertically. I used 1 screw in the center of each picket on the first layer, like you can see here, and then when I was doing the second layer, I used 2 screws on each picket, 1 on either edge, making sure it was going through the first layer as well, which helps create a really strong fence. I screwed each picket into all 3 of the backer rails, which will help prevent any of the pieces from warping over time. When I got to the corner, I ran into the issue of the end picket not fitting into place. This was a pretty quick fix, and I just traced out a little rectangular piece and cut it out with my jigsaw. This worked out great, and you'll see in a bit that this top portion is all going to get covered up anyway. I then moved on to the gate side of the fence, starting with just this one picket which I attached to cover up the leftmost post. I planned out where these hinges were going to go, but before I installed them, I needed to make a cutout. I traced over the ends of the hinge that extended past the first picket. I then cut these little spade-shaped pieces out with my jigsaw, and you'll see what they are for later. I could then proceed with attaching the hinges to this fence post. The pickets for the gate needed shorter screws because this metal piece wasn't as thick as the backer rails. This took a little bit longer because I had to drill through metal every time, but the basic process of laying the pickets was the same as before. I did also use some clamps on the end pieces just to make sure the pickets were lined up perfectly with the edge of the gate. I got everything lined up and level and then attached it to the topmost hinge. I definitely recommend doing this before you've got all your pickets attached, because then the gate will be a lot heavier and this will be much harder to do. Once I was happy with how everything lined up, I could go ahead and install the bottom hinge. This is where those little pieces come into play. You can see in the background that the hinge overlaps the first picket, and since this is a 2-layered fence, we need this little spacer so that the screw has something tight to push against and attaches it firmly to the gate. I also did this for the top hinge but didn't have any footage of it. After making sure the gate swung freely and without any issues, I went ahead and started installing the pickets for the gate, just in the same way that I did the previous ones for the right side of the fence. I was on a roll that day, so decided to just work a little bit into the night to make some more progress before morning. Once I got these rightmost end pieces in place, I could install the gate latch hardware. You can see how this end picket overlaps the edge of the fence post just a little bit, but I needed a flat surface to install this latch piece. I marked off the edges where I wanted it to go, and then used my jigsaw to cut out a little notch. Everything fit perfectly, and I was able to just bolt it in to the side of the fence post. Then I lined up the front side of the latch and installed that as well. With that working properly, I went through and completed the remaining pickets. This is optional, but I also wanted to add a trim rail to the top of my fence. I started with a 2x4 and just ripped off the edges so I would have sharp corners. Then I cut it to size and sanded off any of these branding marks. I checked for level and then drilled these pieces from the top into the fence posts. I also had to make sure I kept an equal amount of overhang all along the fence. I had to do this end piece separately since it wouldn't be moving with the swinging gate. I realized the gate wouldn't be able to open with a setup like this, so I needed to cut 45-degree angles on both pieces so that there was room for movement. With the top piece in place, I ripped down a couple of spare pickets that I had to use as trim pieces. These will go just underneath the top rail and will hide all the picket dog ears. Adding this topper isn't too much extra work, and I feel that it really elevates the look of any fence. Lastly, I wanted to address these gaps that occur where the edges of the gate are. All I did was screw in a thin piece of wood behind each gap, and it worked perfectly. With all the construction done, it was time to put a finish on the wood. I used this little piece of paper against my house just as an easy way to make sure that I don't get any on the siding. It's extremely important that you put some kind of finish on your fence, otherwise it'll rot and deteriorate and could become discolored and gray like my original fence. I went with this dark brown color because it matches some of the trim on the front of my house, but you can use any color you want, even clear if you like the natural color of the wood. Just make sure you use something specifically designed for outdoor use. They make all kinds of finishes for fences and decks, so you'll have plenty of options. You can always tape off this hardware before going around it, but it actually does wipe off pretty easily. So I just did my best to go around it, and then any spots that I got on the hardware, I just wiped off while the finish was still wet, and it comes right off. These pickets can really absorb a lot of the finish, so be prepared to use a lot of it. I found that it was easiest to get all the edges and corners first, and then come back over on all the flat parts. I stained this side fencing as well to give the whole thing a more unified look. After it was all dry, I went back and gave everything a second coat. You can see how much of a difference it makes here in this still frame. The left side has 2 coats, and you can see it looks darker and much more uniform, and I think it just gives a better appearance to the whole fence. Once the second coat was dry, I was done. Here you can see the full transformation. This was a really fun project to work on, and it really wasn't too difficult. It just takes a bit of planning and patience. Upgrading an old fence is an underrated home improvement. It doesn't cost that much and can make a huge difference to the way things look. If you ever do try and replace your own fence, I hope you learned some techniques from this video that can help you along the way. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.